"You're sitting in my seat." Julia Reyes said it flatly, arms full of case files, staring down at the silent, expensively dressed stranger who'd taken the aisle spot she'd claimed every single day this trial had run. He looked up at her, unhurried, saying nothing, his dark eyes assessing her with an intensity that should have unsettled her more than it did. "I'm sorry," he said finally, his voice low and controlled. "Third row aisle side. I've sat there every day for 2 weeks. There are 40 other open seats in this gallery." Julia gestured at the half-empty overflow section, her tone carrying the particular impatience of someone who'd woken up too early and cared too much about routine. The stranger studied her a moment longer, something unreadable moving behind his composed expression, and then without a single word of protest rose and moved 1 row back. Julia claimed her seat with a small, satisfied huff, already pulling out her legal pad, already 3 steps ahead in her head toward the morning's testimony schedule. She didn't think about the stranger again until the bailiff called the courtroom to order, and the entire room, attorneys, clerks, even the judge's own assistant, rose to their feet with a visible, unmistakable deference the moment a name was murmured near the bench. "Damian Carbone," someone whispered behind her, reverent and wary in equal measure. Julia's stomach dropped straight through the courthouse floor. She turned, slow and mortified, toward the row behind her and found the silent stranger, the man she'd just scolded over a seat, watching her with something that might have been amusement, if his expression hadn't been so carefully controlled. Julia knew that name. Everyone who worked at Whitfield and Associates knew that name. The Carbone family's history ran directly through the reopened case her firm was currently litigating, decades-old evidence connected to Damian's own late father, evidence her firm's client had waited years to see brought back into daylight. She had just told a man whose family this entire case revolved around that he was sitting in her seat. "I didn't realize," she started, heat crawling up her neck. "I noticed," Damian said, something almost like amusement threading through his controlled voice. "You didn't ask who I was before telling me to move. Most people in this courthouse ask first. Should I have?" "No," Damian said, and something in the simplicity of that single word told Julia this wasn't the end of the conversation, whatever she might have preferred. The morning's proceedings resumed, testimony unfolding in the careful, methodical rhythm Julia had come to know intimately over 2 weeks of watching every filing, every witness statement, every procedural detail with an attention nobody else at her firm bothered to match. She caught herself more than once aware of Damian Carbone's presence 1 row behind her, silent, watchful, following the case with an intensity that matched her own. By the time court adjourned for the day, Julia understood 2 things with unsettling clarity. First, that Damian Carbone had no obvious reason to be personally present at every single hearing of a case connected to his family's old, buried history. Second, that whatever reason actually brought him here, it mattered enough that he'd sat through her scolding him over a seat without correcting her identity even once. She gathered her files, aware of his eyes still on her from across the emptying gallery, and understood with sudden unease that this case had just become considerably more complicated than the careful, methodical filing review she'd signed up for. Julia Reyes was 29 years old, and the 2 years she'd spent as a paralegal at Whitfield and Associates in Philadelphia represented the careful, deliberate first steps of a legal career she'd been building since she was old enough to understand what the word justice actually meant to her personally. She lived in a modest apartment in the city's Fairmount neighborhood, close enough to walk to the courthouse most mornings, rent manageable only through careful budgeting around law school loans she was still paying down from an abandoned attempt at her JD. A dream deferred, not abandoned entirely, when her mother's declining health 5 years earlier had required Julia to step back from full-time study and pick up steady, dependable work instead. She still carried her LCT prep books in a box under her bed, untouched but never discarded, a quiet promise to herself that the deferral was temporary. Her financial pressure was constant and specific. Her mother's ongoing care costs, only partially covered by insurance, alongside her own remaining loan payments, a balance Julia managed through careful, unglamorous discipline rather than any dramatic sacrifice. Her personal goal, held close and rarely discussed with colleagues who'd finished their own degrees years earlier, was to eventually return to law school once her mother's care situation stabilized, finishing what she'd started rather than letting the interruption become permanent. Her emotional wound ran deep and specific. She'd watched her mother's early symptoms get dismissed by an overworked, dismissive first doctor, A diagnosis delayed by months because nobody had bothered reading her chart carefully enough to catch the pattern early. Julia had promised herself, in the aftermath of that costly oversight, that she would never be the kind of professional who skimmed instead of truly reading. That careful, thorough attention to detail wasn't tedious perfectionism, but the actual difference between catching something that mattered and missing it until it was too late. Her moral boundary was simple and unbending. She read every filing twice, cross-referenced every date, verified every detail personally rather than trusting summaries, not because her supervising attorneys required it, but because cutting that corner felt, to her, like exactly the kind of failure that had once cost her mother months of unnecessary suffering. Her practical skill, honed through 2 years of meticulous casework, was an almost photographic memory for documents, dates, timestamps, minor inconsistencies between filings that most people's eyes simply slid past. It wasn't a skill anyone had specifically trained her in. It was simply how carefully she'd learned to read. The recurring object she carried, tucked into her bag every single day, was her mother's old reading glasses, broken now, one arm missing, kept not for practical use but as a small, physical reminder of exactly why careful attention mattered so much to her. The week before the Carbone case reopened, Julia had stayed 2 hours past the end of her shift, unpaid, cross-referencing an elderly witness's decades-old testimony against current filing records, catching a date discrepancy that would have undermined the witness's credibility if left unaddressed. Nobody had asked her to do that extra work. She'd done it because letting a vulnerable elderly witness get discredited over a clerical error nobody bothered checking felt like exactly the kind of oversight she'd promised herself she'd never allow. That same instinct, meticulous, unglamorous, entirely without calculation, was exactly what had her sitting in that same courthouse seat every single morning, reading every document twice, long before Damian Carbone ever sat down beside her. Standing in the emptying courtroom that afternoon, gathering her files while Damian Carbone's watchful presence lingered at the edge of her awareness, Julia understood she'd stumbled into something considerably larger than a routine filing review. A case with a Mafia family's actual living history attached to it, and a man whose composed, careful attention suggested he was watching this trial for reasons that went far beyond simple curiosity. Miss Reyes. Her supervising attorney, David Kaminsky, caught her at the courthouse doors, expression tight with something between excitement and concern. "I need you to double-check something in the Hartwell testimony filing before tomorrow. There's a discrepancy in the sealed record dates that doesn't match what we filed originally." Julia's stomach tightened with the same careful, exacting focus that had once caught a decades-old date error. "I'll look at it tonight." She had no idea yet that the discrepancy she was about to find would connect directly to a leak inside her own firm, or that Damian Carbone's quiet, watchful presence in that courtroom gallery was about to become the only thing standing between her and considerable danger. Damian Carbone found her the following evening, waiting outside the firm's office building as Julia emerged after another late night of careful, methodical review. "You're still here," he said, unhurried, watching her with the same composed attention she remembered from the courtroom gallery. "Some of us don't get to leave when the day's testimony ends," Julia said, adjusting the weight of her bag. "Why are you here, Mr. Carbone?" "Damian," he said. "And I think you already suspect why." Julia studied him properly for the first time outside the courtroom's formal distance. Composed, careful, radiating an authority that felt entirely out of place against the ordinary backdrop of a downtown office building at dusk. "You've been at every single hearing," she said. "That's not casual interest in a decades-old case." "No," Damian admitted. "It isn't. The case involves your father," Julia said slowly, piecing together what her 2 weeks of careful filing review had already suggested. "The old testimony being reopened, it's connected to something that happened in your family years ago." "My father was implicated in a case that never fully resolved," Damian said carefully. "I testified against him years ago when I was young enough to still believe the truth mattered more than family loyalty. Cost me considerably more than I expected it to. I've been watching this reopened case because I need to understand exactly what's being uncovered, and whether it's genuinely about justice or about something else entirely." Julia's instinctive wariness sharpened. "Something else like what?" "My family has interests across the city," Damian said. "Some legitimate. Some considerably older and more complicated than that. If someone's reopening this case for reasons beyond genuine justice, I need to know who and why before it costs someone else what testifying against my father cost me. Mafia, Julia said flatly, the word landing between them without much surprise attached to it. She'd half suspected as much from the moment the entire courtroom rose at his name. That's the word people use, Damian said, not denying it. Every professional instinct told Julia to end this conversation, to retreat into the careful, ethical distance her role required. But something about his directness, offered without excuse, without minimizing what testifying against his own father had actually cost him, kept her rooted where she stood. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "I'm a paralegal. I don't have the authority to tell you anything about ongoing case strategy." "I'm not asking for case strategy," Damian said. "I'm asking because you're the person actually reading every filing twice. My own people can access court records. They can't tell me whether the details in those records are being handled honestly, or whether something's being manipulated underneath the official version. You'd know that if anyone would." Julia considered that, surprised by the careful respect embedded in the observation. Not flattery but genuine, accurate assessment of exactly what her meticulous work actually amounted to. "I found a discrepancy last night," she admitted before she'd fully decided to share it. "Sealed record dates that don't match our original filing. I haven't reported it up the chain yet." Something sharpened behind Damian's composed expression. "What kind of discrepancy?" "I can't discuss ongoing case details with someone connected to the family involved," Julia said, catching herself, professional caution reasserting itself. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have said that much already." "I understand," Damian said, though something in his controlled voice suggested the discrepancy mattered more to him than he was willing to press her about directly. "I won't ask you to compromise your position. I just need you to understand something in case it becomes relevant later." "What's that?" "If someone inside your firm is manipulating sealed records connected to my family's case," Damian said, "that person isn't doing it for abstract reasons. They're doing it because someone's paying them to, and that kind of money usually comes from people who don't tolerate loose ends well." Julia's stomach tightened with sudden, cold understanding. "Are you saying I might be in danger?" "I'm saying I'd rather warn you unnecessarily than not warn you at all," Damian said. "I have no interest in frightening you over nothing. But I have considerable experience with exactly how ugly things get when someone realizes the wrong person noticed the wrong detail." Their conversation was interrupted by Julia's phone buzzing. A text from David Kaminsky, terse and unusually urgent. "Need to see you first thing tomorrow. The Hartwell filing discrepancy. Don't discuss it with anyone else tonight." Julia looked up from her phone unsettled. "My supervising attorney just told me not to discuss the exact discrepancy I mentioned to you with anyone." Damian's expression went carefully, deliberately still. "That's not a coincidence I'd feel comfortable ignoring," he said quietly. Julia arrived at the office the following morning to find her desk drawer slightly ajar. Nothing obviously missing, but disturbed in a way that made her stomach drop immediately, the specific deliberate wrongness she'd learned to trust instinctively. She called Damian before she'd fully decided to, adrenaline overriding the careful professional distance she'd maintained the night before. "Someone went through my desk," she said, voice tighter than she wanted it to be. "Files are out of order. Nothing's obviously missing, but I know exactly how I left everything." Damian's response was instant, sharp with alarm. "Don't touch anything else. I'm coming to you." He arrived within the hour, and his presence at Whitfield and Associates, composed, unmistakably powerful, flanked by two men who positioned themselves near the office's entrance with quiet, deliberate purpose, drew exactly the kind of attention Julia had feared it would. "Mr. Carbone," David Kaminsky said, emerging from his office with visible unease, "is there a concern I should be aware of?" "There is," Damian said. "Someone accessed Miss Reyes's desk overnight, disturbing files related to the sealed record discrepancy she found. I'd like to understand who had access to this office after hours." David's expression tightened with a discomfort that struck Julia, watching carefully as something closer to fear than simple professional concern. "I'll look into it personally." "Please do," Damian said, something cold and absolute beneath his controlled courtesy. The consequence of Damian's visible attention arrived within the day. Frank Ferraro, a senior associate at the firm who'd handled several of the Carbone case's earlier procedural filings, approached Julia at her desk that afternoon with a carefully casual demeanor that didn't quite mask his underlying tension. "I heard about your desk," Frank said. "Strange business. You should be more careful about which cases you get personally invested in, Julia. Some of these old family matters carry weight you don't fully understand." "Is that a warning?" Julia asked, something in his careful phrasing setting off instincts she'd been sharpening for the past 2 days. "It's advice," Frank said, smiling in a way that didn't reach his eyes. "From someone who's handled cases like this longer than you have." Julia watched him walk away, unsettled by an interaction she couldn't yet fully articulate the wrongness of, and made a note, careful, precise, the same instinct that had once caught a decades-old date discrepancy, to review Frank's filing history more closely. Damian's protective attention escalated further over the following days. He requested through David Kaminsky that Julia's work on the Carbone case be reviewed under additional security given the apparent break-in, an arrangement that drew visible resentment from several colleagues who felt Julia's position was being inflated beyond her actual role. "You're becoming a liability to this firm's neutrality," David told her privately, clearly torn between professional caution and something closer to genuine worry. "Carbone's attention on you specifically is making certain partners nervous. I need you to understand the position this puts all of us in." "I didn't ask for his attention," Julia said. "I found a discrepancy doing my job exactly the way I'm supposed to do it." "I know," David admitted. "That doesn't change the position it puts you in." The external consequence that finally made the danger undeniable arrived that same evening. Julia returned to her apartment to find the lock scratched, clearly tampered with though not successfully breached, and a folder of case-related documents, copies she'd kept at home for her own careful review, missing entirely from where she'd left them. She called Damian immediately, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking. "Someone broke into my apartment. My personal copies of the case files are gone." Damian's response was instant, sharp with alarm. "Don't stay there tonight. I'm sending a car." "Damian, I have a job, an ongoing case, a life I can't just abandon." "I know," he said, and the genuine regret in his voice was unmistakable. "I'm not asking you to abandon any of it. I'm asking you to let me keep you safe while we figure out exactly who's responsible, because whoever's doing this has now escalated from your office to your home in less than a week." Julia stood in her apartment doorway, staring at the scratched lock, feeling the careful, deliberate independence she'd built her entire adult life around begin to fracture. "If I do this," she said finally, "it's on my terms. I keep working the case. Keep my job. I'm not disappearing into your world completely." "Agreed," Damian said without hesitation. "Whatever you need." She packed a small bag under the watchful eye of Damian's driver 20 minutes later, her mother's broken reading glasses tucked carefully into her coat pocket, and didn't look back at the apartment she'd called home for 3 years. Whatever came next, there was no simple path back to her ordinary, careful life anymore. The secured townhouse where Julia now stayed under Damian's protection felt, over the following days, increasingly less like a temporary safe house and more like a shared, complicated space neither of them fully acknowledged out loud. Scene 1 came the next morning, practical and immediate. Julia found Damian in the kitchen before dawn, reviewing case documents with the same exacting focus she brought to everything, a legal pad covered in careful cross-references. "You've been at this all night," she said, setting coffee beside him without being asked. "I keep trying to understand exactly what Frank Ferraro's role in this actually is," Damian said. "He handled the original procedural filings for this case 8 years ago, before it was ever reopened. If he's the one manipulating the sealed record dates now, I need to understand what he stood to gain from it back then, and what's changed to make him risk it again now." "I noticed something in his filing history yesterday," Julia said, pulling out her own notes. "A gap in the visitor logs for the records room, the same week the original sealed testimony was filed. I didn't think much of it until now." "That's exactly the kind of detail my own people wouldn't think to look for," Damian said, studying her work with genuine admiration. "You have a real talent for this." "It's not talent," Julia said. "It's just reading carefully instead of skimming. Most people skim." Scene 2 arrived 3 days later, an argument sharper than either expected. Damian announced over a quiet dinner that he wanted to remove Julia from active work on the Carbone case entirely, keeping her safely occupied with unrelated firm business instead. Absolutely not, Julia said immediately. I told you I wanted to keep working this case. Taking me off it isn't protection, it's just another version of deciding what's best for me without asking. Julia, if Frank realizes how close you are to exposing him, then we address that specific risk, but you don't get to keep changing the terms every time you get nervous, she said, voice rising with genuine frustration. I spent years watching my mother's illness get missed because everyone around her hesitated instead of paying proper attention. I am not going to let fear make me abandon the one piece of careful, meaningful work I've actually built for myself. Damian sat back, absorbing the force of it, and for the first time actually paused instead of immediately defending his position. You're right, he said finally. Tell me what would actually work instead. Julia's anger softened at the honesty. Keep me on the case. Add security if you're genuinely worried, but don't take away what I've actually earned. Let me decide how to handle the real risk. Done, Damian said, meaning it. Scene 3 came on the 7th night, when Julia found him alone on the townhouse's small balcony, a glass of scotch he wasn't drinking held loosely in one hand. I was 23 when I testified against my father, Damian said, before she'd even asked what was wrong. He'd built half of what this family has, and I stood up in a courtroom and told the truth about things he'd done that I couldn't reconcile with the man who raised me. My testimony helped convict him on charges that kept him in prison until he died 3 years later, alone, without ever speaking to me again. His voice went quiet. Everyone told me afterward that I'd done the right thing. Nobody told me how much it would cost or how long that cost would keep accumulating years after the trial ended. Julia sat down beside him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. That's not a small thing to carry. I've spent years telling myself the decision was simple. Truth mattered more than loyalty, and I made the right choice, Damian said. Watching this case reopen, watching someone try to manipulate the record now years later, it's forcing me to confront whether the cost was actually worth it, or whether I just told myself that story to survive what I'd done. Was it worth it? Julia asked gently. I don't know, Damian admitted, something raw and unguarded moving across his face. I know the truth mattered. I know staying silent would have meant becoming complicit in things I couldn't live with. But I also lost my father, my standing within parts of my own family, years of relationships that never fully recovered. Doing the right thing didn't undo any of that cost. It just meant I could live with myself afterward. That's not nothing, Julia said quietly. Being able to live with yourself is worth more than people give it credit for. I understand that better than I'd like to, honestly. I watched a doctor's careless oversight cost my mother months of unnecessary suffering, and I promised myself I'd never let that kind of carelessness be something I was responsible for. It's cost me things too, time, opportunities, an easier path through my own career. But I can live with the choices I've made because of it. He looked at her, something shifting, fully open in his expression. You keep finding exactly the thing I need to hear. I read people the same way I read filings, Julia said. Carefully. It's the same skill, just pointed at something harder to quantify. They sat in silence that wasn't uncomfortable, the city lights spreading beyond the balcony, and something passed between them that wasn't yet spoken but was undeniably present. Two people who'd both learned, through costly, difficult choices, exactly how much courage doing the right thing actually required. It was David Kaminsky who broke the moment, calling Julia's phone with news urgent enough that she answered despite the late hour. Julia, he said, voice tight. I finally cross-referenced the records room visitor log against Frank's personal calendar. There's an entry, after-hours access, the same week the sealed testimony dates were altered. It's Frank's signature. He accessed the sealed files himself, alone, after the records room officially closed. Julia's stomach dropped. That confirms it. It confirms opportunity, David said. It doesn't confirm he'll go quietly. Julia, I think you should be very careful. If he realizes how close this evidence is to becoming public. The line went dead before David finished the sentence. Julia stared at her phone, adrenaline flooding through her. David just hung up mid-sentence, she said slowly. That's not like him. Damian was already moving, already reaching for his own phone. Then we need to find out why, right now. Damian's men reached David Kaminsky's office within 20 minutes. Finding him shaken but unharmed. His phone battery had simply died mid-call, An innocuous explanation that did nothing to slow the momentum of what Julia's confirmation had already set in motion. Frank accessed those sealed files himself, Julia said, sitting across from Damian and David in the firm's conference room the following morning. The visitor log evidence spread between them. Alone after hours the same week the dates were altered. That's not circumstantial anymore. Why would he do this? Damian asked. What does Frank actually gain from manipulating my family's sealed case records? David, visibly uncomfortable, finally spoke. I've suspected for a while that Frank's been taking money from outside interests to influence certain cases. I never had proof. I didn't want to believe it about someone I've worked alongside for a decade. Whose money? Damian asked, voice going cold. I don't know for certain, David admitted. But given the case involved and given how carefully the timeline manipulation was executed, someone with a genuine stake in keeping your father's old case buried, or in controlling exactly how it resurfaces now. The confrontation happened faster than anyone expected. Frank, apparently sensing the net tightening, cornered Julia in the firm's records room that same afternoon, while Damian was occupied in a call 2 floors up. You've been busy, Frank said, his voice carrying a controlled menace Julia had never heard from him before. Digging through visitor logs. Asking questions you have no business asking. I have every business asking, Julia said, backing carefully toward the doorway, calculating distance and exits with the same careful precision she brought to reading a filing. You accessed sealed records after hours and altered testimony dates. That's not something I imagined. And now you know, Frank said, closing the distance. Which makes you a considerable problem. Damian already knows everything, Julia said, keeping her voice as steady as she could manage. The evidence exists whether you silence me or not. Evidence can be discredited, Frank said. Especially evidence connected to a paralegal who's clearly become personally entangled with a man whose family this case revolves around. Nobody will believe your objectivity once that becomes public. Julia's pulse hammered, but her training, years of careful, methodical thinking under pressure, held. You're not thinking clearly, she said. If something happens to me now, right after you've been implicated, that makes you look considerably guiltier, not less. Something in Frank's expression flickered, genuine calculation warring with cornered panic. Before he could respond, the records room door opened behind him, and Damian stood in the doorway, expression gone completely cold. Step away from her, Damian said, voice absolutely lethal. Frank turned, whatever composure he'd maintained cracking entirely. Damian, this isn't what it looks like. It's exactly what it looks like, Damian said. You altered sealed records connected to my family's case. You were paid by someone with a stake in controlling what surfaces. And now I find you threatening the one person whose careful attention exposed it. There's nothing left to explain. 10 years I've worked this firm, Frank said, desperation cracking through. You're going to destroy my career over old family history that should have stayed buried. You destroyed your own career, Damian said, the moment you decided a payoff mattered more than doing your job honestly. Security arrived moments later, restraining Frank before the confrontation could escalate further. In the sudden, ringing quiet afterward, Damian crossed the room fast, checking Julia carefully. Are you hurt? Julia, look at me. I'm okay, she managed, hands shaking now that the immediate danger had passed. We're okay. Damian's hand found hers, steady and certain, and Julia understood that whatever came next would change everything permanently, not just for Frank but for the fragile, careful trust they'd built between them. The full scope of Frank's betrayal became clear over the following 2 days, as Damian's investigators traced the payment trail behind the manipulated records. The money originated from a source Damian recognized immediately, viscerally, a rival family with old, unresolved grievances against the Carbones, one who stood to benefit considerably from Damian's father's old crimes resurfacing in a carefully controlled, damaging way rather than the honest, complete truth Julia's meticulous review had uncovered. They wanted the case reopened, Damian said, studying the evidence with grim understanding. Just not honestly. They wanted a version that would damage my family's standing without exposing their own involvement in what actually happened decades ago. And Frank was willing to manufacture that version for the right price, Julia said. Yes, Damian said, something resolving fully behind his controlled expression. Which means the only way to actually protect the truth now is to make sure it comes out completely. Not the manipulated version Frank was building, not a version anyone can control or spin. The real, full history, sealed records and all. Julia's stomach tightened. That means unsealing decades of protected family records. Everything, not just the parts favorable to you. Yes, Damian said quietly. Exactly that. The decision crystallized over the following days. Damian wrestling visibly with a choice that would cost him considerably more than simply exposing Frank Ferraro's betrayal. You don't have to unseal everything, his cousin Renata argued in his office, legal documents spread across the desk. Frank's arrest and disbarment handles the immediate threat. You can let the sealed records stay sealed, protect decades of family privacy your father's case never should have exposed in the first place. If I keep anything sealed now, Damian said, I'm doing exactly what Frank was paid to do, controlling which parts of the truth become public and which parts stay hidden. The only difference is intent, and intent doesn't matter to the people this history actually affected. It matters to this family, Renata said. Your mother's still alive, Damian. Aunts, cousins, people who've spent decades trying to move past what your father did. Unsealing everything reopens wounds that took years to even partially heal. Damian was quiet a long moment, something raw moving behind his composed expression. I know, he said finally. I've thought about exactly that more than you'd guess. But I also spent years believing that testifying against my father was the hardest, most costly right thing I'd ever have to do. And then watching someone try to manipulate that same truth for profit taught me something I should have understood back then already. He met Renata's eyes directly. Partial truth, controlled truth isn't actually truth at all. It's just a different flavor of the same cover-up my father spent his whole life building. I'm not doing that again, even if it costs this family considerably more than Frank's exposure alone would. It was, Julia would understand later, the single most costly decision Damian made throughout the entire investigation. Not the confrontation with Frank directly, but the deliberate, complete unsealing of his family's protected legal history, exposing decades of carefully guarded privacy to public record specifically to ensure no one could ever again manipulate a controlled, partial version of the truth for their own benefit. He announced the unsealing publicly, working directly with the court to release the complete, unredacted history connected to his father's original case. Evidence that implicated not just his father, but exposed uncomfortable details about extended family members, business associates, and decades of quiet complicity that many in Damian's world had assumed would stay buried indefinitely. The fallout was immediate and significant. Several relatives, furious at the public exposure of decades-old family shame, distanced themselves from Damian entirely. Business associates who'd relied on certain protected details staying private grew visibly wary of continued association. Damian's mother, informed of the decision before it became public, wept through an entire difficult conversation Julia wasn't present for but heard about afterward in Damian's own quiet, exhausted account. She understood, Damian told Julia, finding her in his office that evening, exhausted in a way she hadn't seen from him before. Eventually. It took a long conversation and I don't think she's fully at peace with it yet. But she understood why I couldn't let a manipulated version stand, even to protect her from renewed pain. That's an enormous cost, Julia said quietly. It is, Damian agreed. I'd pay it again without hesitation. Why? Julia asked, needing to understand fully. You could have let Frank's arrest handle the immediate threat. Kept the rest sealed, protected your family from renewed exposure. For years I told myself that testifying against my father was the one costly truth I'd ever have to tell, Damian said. That doing it once meant I'd paid whatever debt honesty required of me. Watching Frank try to manipulate that same history for profit showed me exactly how naive that belief actually was. Truth isn't a debt you pay once. It's something you keep choosing, especially when choosing it costs you. He met her eyes directly. You taught me that without meaning to. Watching you read every filing twice, refused to let a single detail slide because it was inconvenient to notice. That's not really different from what I just did. It's just a bigger, more painful version of the same choice. Julia was quiet a long moment, weighing everything he'd admitted against the fierce independence she'd fought to protect throughout this entire ordeal. I need you to understand something too, she said finally. I'm not interested in staying close to you because I feel like I owe you anything for protecting me from Frank, or because you made an enormous, costly sacrifice with your family's history. I've spent my whole life believing careful attention and honest effort matter on their own terms, not because they earn me anything in return. That's exactly what I want you to understand too, Damian said. Whatever you choose next, it has to be entirely yours. Frank Ferraro's arrest and disbarment concluded within the month. The evidence Julia had assembled, the visitor logs, the payment trail, her own precise, detailed account of his threats in the records room, leaving no room for his earlier scheme to survive scrutiny. You didn't have to testify in person, the investigating attorney told her afterward. A lot of witnesses in your position would have accepted a written statement. He tried to discredit me and threaten me to protect a manipulation scheme, Julia said simply. I'm not interested in letting that happen quietly, where it's easier for people to look away from. Damian found her afterward outside the courthouse, the same building where all of this had started with a scolding over a stolen seat. It's over, he said. Frank's disbarred. The unsealed records are fully public now. Whatever comes next for my family, it's out of my hands and into the world honestly for the first time in decades. How does that feel? Julia asked. Terrifying, Damian admitted. And also, somehow, considerably lighter than I expected. I spent years believing controlling the narrative around my father's history was the only way to protect what remained of my family's dignity. Watching you insist on the full truth, every single time, taught me that dignity actually comes from something else entirely.